Hello, you can call me Tuva. My story takes place at the end of the 80s, 1988, if I remember correctly. I grew up in northern Norway, in a small village by the sea, where everyone knew each other, for better or worse. I'll leave out the name of the village out of respect for those still living there. My name and the names of the others in this story are made up, but everything else is true. My sister Johanna and I were very close growing up, being just 15 months apart. Johanna was the oldest, and we spent most of our time together, along with another girl our age, Astrid. We did the usual things girls did back then, played with dolls, explored the woods, and made up our own adventures. Unlike kids today, we were always outside, climbing trees, wandering through the forest, and even doing some mischief around the village. But we were generally well behaved. Our grandmother lived not too far from us, and we often visited her. She'd give us freshly baked buns and juice, and sometimes we would stay over at her house. Grandma had something she called a troll table, a table that she and her friends used to communicate with the other side during seances. We were never allowed to join in, but sometimes, when we stayed over, Johanna, Astrid, and I would spy on them. We'd crouch behind the staircase, watching in fascination as they asked questions, and the table would tilt for yes or no. Occasionally, to clarify answers, Grandma would go through the alphabet, and the table would tap on the last letter she said, spelling out words. One cold, damp autumn evening, the three of us were playing outside. We had been to the village, bought some candy, and played on the swings at the playground. Astrid's parents were away on a trip, so she was staying with us that weekend. As the night set in, the air grew colder, and we decided it was time to head home. On the way back, Johanna suggested we stop by Grandma's house to see if she had any freshly baked buns. The village looked cozy in the dark, with all the lights from the houses twinkling, and the northern lights starting to dance across the sky. When we got to Grandma's house, it was dark. We knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Instead of leaving, we remembered that Grandma had shown us where she kept a spare key hidden outside, just in case we needed it. We unlocked the door, called out to her, but still, no response. The warmth inside was inviting, so we stepped in, took off our coats, and decided to check if Grandma was maybe asleep. She wasn't home. We didn't mind. Instead, we raided the kitchen, found some cookies, and Johanna warmed up milk so we could make hot chocolate. We sat at the table, laughing and enjoying ourselves. After a while, I suggested we play a board game, so we headed into the living room to find one. That's when Johanna spotted Grandma's troll table. "Let's play with this instead," Johanna said. "No, we can't," I replied. "Grandma told us never to use it." "She's not here, don't be such a coward," Johanna teased, and Astrid giggled in agreement. They were always on the same side, being closer in age and in the same class at school. Not wanting to be called a coward, I reluctantly agreed. Johanna told me to get the candles, and Astrid turned off the lights. The room felt unnaturally dark, even with the flickering candlelight. Johanna started making ghost noises, trying to scare us. I didn't find it funny. After sitting in silence for a bit, Johanna asked, "So, what should we ask it?" "I don't know," I replied, feeling uneasy. Astrid was the first to speak up. "Hello. Is anyone there?" Nothing happened. I let out a breath, relieved. "See? It doesn't work," I said, hoping we could stop. Johanna wasn't giving up. "What's your name?" she asked the table. Still, no response. I was about to suggest we pack it in when suddenly, the table shook, tilting to one side. I screamed, thinking Johanna or Astrid were messing with me, but they both looked just as terrified. "It's not us," they yelled, showing their hands. The table leaned back to its original position. I was scared, but I didn't say anything. Astrid asked, "Are you a ghost?" The table leaned in the opposite direction. No. "What are you, then?" Johanna asked, her voice shaking slightly. The table began tapping again, spelling something out. Johanna called out the letters as she went through the alphabet, K, N-E. Knowledge? Johanna asked, bewildered. The table tilted for yes. Are you friendly? I blurted out, hoping for a yes. The table tilted yes again, and I felt a slight relief, though I was still terrified. Are you dead? Johanna asked next. My heart sank. I hated that question. Death had always scared me. The table answered no. I couldn't take it anymore. I don't want to do this anymore. Can we stop, please? I stood up, my voice shaky with fear. Johanna and Astrid started laughing at me, but their laughter didn't last. All of a sudden, the table began to shake violently, the candles blew out, and a horrible, rotting stench filled the room. Astrid and Johanna stopped laughing, their faces now as pale and terrified as mine. Then I saw something I'll never forget. Johanna's face began to change. It twisted into something unnatural, something evil. She grabbed my arm with unnatural strength and let out a horrifying, guttural scream. I yelled for her to stop, to let me go, but she just stared at me with eyes that weren't hers. Astrid rushed forward, trying to pull me free, but Johanna's grip was like iron. That's when we heard the front door open and Grandma's voice calling out, "What's going on?" Grandma rushed into the living room, her eyes widening as she saw us with the troll table. "In the name of Jesus, leave," she shouted. The table began to thrash violently before suddenly stopping. Johanna let go of me and collapsed back into her chair. The air in the room shifted. It felt lighter, calmer, like whatever had been there was gone. Grandma turned on the lights, and Johanna, looking completely exhausted, asked, "What happened?" "You were playing with fire," Grandma said sternly, before her face softened. "I told you never to play with that table." We apologized profusely, but Grandma just shook her head and said, "Let this be a lesson. You never know what you're inviting in." That night, Grandma baked us a pie and walked us home. It took weeks to recover from the experience. I had nightmares for months, but eventually, they faded. Johanna, thankfully, didn't remember much. When Grandma passed away 10 years later, we inherited her belongings. The first thing we did was burn the troll table. My advice? Never, ever try to contact the other side. You don't know who or what you'll be talking to. My girlfriend Ingrid and I had been searching for the perfect house for months. So when we found our little dream home in the forest, just a few miles outside of town, we were over the moon. It was peaceful, surrounded by nature, and felt like a perfect escape from the world. We spent the first few months fixing up the garden, going for hikes, and inviting friends over for dinner. Life felt good, and the house quickly became our sanctuary. About 6 months in, though, things started to change. One evening, I was watching TV when Ingrid came rushing into the living room. She looked pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Ben, oh my God. I heard strange noises and 3 knocks in the bedroom when I was hanging laundry," she said, her voice trembling. I tried to calm her down. "Old houses make weird noises all the time," I reassured her. "It's probably just the house settling." But to make her feel better, I went to the bedroom and stood there listening. Nothing. The silence was thick, almost oppressive, but I brushed it off. "See? Nothing to worry about," I said with a smile. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I woke up to Ingrid moaning and mumbling in her sleep. She was having a nightmare, so I gently shook her awake. "You were having a bad dream," I whispered, kissing her forehead. "Yeah," she muttered, still half asleep. "There was a dark figure. It was trying to hurt me. I was paralyzed. Couldn't move. Couldn't scream." I held her close, telling her it was just a dream, and eventually, we both drifted back to sleep. The next few days were uneventful, but then Ingrid started hearing the noises again. Every evening, she would hear scratching sounds followed by the same 3 knocks. She'd run to me, wide-eyed, and I'd go check, but I never heard anything. It became a routine. her hearing strange noises, me finding nothing. I thought it was kind of cute, the way she would get so worked up, but I didn't take it too seriously. Then, one night, I woke up and noticed she wasn't in bed. At first, I figured she was in the bathroom, but after a few minutes, I called out, "Hey babe, are you okay?" No answer. I got up to check, but she wasn't in the bathroom, or the kitchen, or the living room. Panic started to creep in as I searched the house. Finally, I found her in the spare room, standing in the dark, facing the wall. "Ingrid?" I called softly. "What are you doing?" She didn't move. I walked over and gently touched her shoulder. She jumped, screaming in terror. "It's me. It's just me," I said, trying to calm her down. Tears filled her eyes as she told me she didn't remember getting out of bed. The last thing she recalled was dreaming about that same dark figure. The next day, she called her mom and told her everything. That's when her mother reminded her that she used to sleepwalk as a child, something Ingrid had completely forgotten. It stopped when she was 5 or 6, and no one ever mentioned it again. Maybe that's all it was, sleepwalking. But something about it felt off, like there was more to it than that. Things seemed calm for a while after that. We even laughed about it, thinking we were just letting the house and the woods get to us. But then, one night, I was in bed while Ingrid was taking a shower, and I heard it. The scratching sound. And then, the 3 knocks. Goosebumps prickled my skin. I tried to laugh it off, but for the first time I felt genuinely unnerved. Still, I didn't mention it to Ingrid. I didn't want to add to her anxiety. But things didn't get better. Ingrid started feeling like something was watching her, following her around the house. She said it felt evil. I tried to comfort her, telling her it was probably just her mind playing tricks. But deep down, I was starting to feel it too. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of Ingrid's voice, low, raspy, and panicked. "Ben, help. Please help me." I jumped out of bed and followed her voice to the same room where I had found her standing before. What I saw nearly froze me in place. She was struggling, as if something invisible had its hands around her throat. She gasped for air, clawing at her neck, but there was nothing there. For a second, I couldn't move. I couldn't process what I was seeing. Then, instinct kicked in, and I ran toward her. But as I got close, it was like I hit a wall, an invisible force that shoved me backward. I flew a good 2 meters, landing hard on the floor. The air was thick, like something was standing between us, and I could hear heavy, deliberate footsteps coming toward me. I screamed for Ingrid to run. Somehow she managed to break free, and I followed her out of the house. We didn't stop running until we were halfway down the road, panting and shaking. I realized I had left the car keys inside, so I told Ingrid to wait while I went back. Every step I took toward that house felt like it was pulling me in, like it didn't want to let me leave. I grabbed the keys, ran back to the car, and we sped off into the night. We ended up at my brother's place, waking him up at 3 a.m. He took one look at us and joked that we looked like we'd seen a ghost. I didn't laugh. We stayed with him for a few days, long enough to find a new place. We never went back to that house except to grab our things, and even then, I didn't stay a second longer than I had to. Whatever was in that house, whatever was watching us, it let us leave. But I'm sure it's still there, waiting. And I'll never go back to find out what it wants. Hi, my name is Eric, and this is my eerie camping story. It was the summer of 2019, and I decided to take a short solo camping trip before my friends joined me for a longer vacation. I had done solo camping before without any issues, so I thought, why not? I packed my gear, eager to spend a few peaceful days in the Swedish forests. After about an hour and a half of driving, I arrived at a new spot I had found on the map. I had planned to camp in 3 different locations, one night deep in the forest, and the next 2 nights by a lake. Excited, I laced up my boots, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and stepped into the wilderness. The heat of the day was quickly replaced by the cool shade of the trees. The smell of spruce and moss filled the air, refreshing and grounding. This is the life, I thought, as I hiked deeper into the woods, picking up some kindling along the way. After about an hour, I reached my first campsite. It was secluded, quiet, and beautiful. A perfect spot. I set up my tent right away, making sure everything was in place before gathering more firewood. Soon, a small fire crackled to life, and I sat down, watching the flames dance while I snacked on some sausage and nuts. The fire's warmth and the peaceful birdsong lulled me into a sense of calm. As the sun began to set, I decided to boil some water for my dinner. Meatballs with pasta, a ready-made meal. It wasn't quite as good as my mom's cooking, but everything seems to taste better when you're out in the forest. After eating, I spent a little more time by the fire, letting the hypnotic flames carry me into a daydream before crawling into my tent for the night. I settled into my sleeping bag, scrolling through Instagram for a bit, and sending a few texts to let my friends and family know I was okay. Then, I turned on an audiobook and closed my eyes, ready to drift off to sleep. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost like laughter. I paused the audiobook and listened, my ears straining in the dark. Nothing. Just the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I shook my head, figuring it was just my imagination. It was late, and there shouldn't be any kids out here. Miles from civilization. I shrugged it off and turned the audiobook back on. A few minutes later, there it was again. Laughter. This time it was clearer, more distinct. I turned off the audiobook and grabbed my flashlight, my heart starting to race. I unzipped the tent and peered outside, scanning the area with the beam of light. Nothing but trees. The forest was still, almost unnaturally so. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence. I stood there for a few moments, listening, but the only sound was the distant rustle of leaves. It had to be my imagination. Still, I decided to take the opportunity to step out and relieve myself before heading back to the tent. As I crawled back into my sleeping bag, the uneasy feeling lingered. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation and the darkness playing tricks on me. I turned the audiobook back on and tried to relax. Then, I heard it again. Laughter, but this time it was closer, clearer. There was no denying it now. Someone, or something, was out there. I turned off the audiobook and held my breath, trying to listen more closely. My heart pounded in my chest, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The laughter came again, followed by the sound of footsteps, light, quick, almost playful. They seemed to be circling the tent, moving in and out of the shadows. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my hands shaking as I called out, "Whoever's out there, this isn't funny! I have a knife!" But there was no response. Only more laughter, now mixed with faint, almost childlike singing. The sound was all around me, echoing through the trees. It felt like there were multiple voices, moving in every direction. My pulse quickened as the footsteps grew louder, faster, like they were running in circles around the tent. The laughter became more mocking, more sinister, as if they were toying with me. The tent began to shake, as if someone, or something, was hitting the sides, laughing and singing all the while. I couldn't make out the words, but the melody was haunting, unfamiliar. It sounded ancient, something that didn't belong in this place or time. I was certain now, this was something paranormal, something far beyond my control. Panic set in, and I knew I had to get out of there. I quickly dressed, shoving my keys and wallet into my pockets. With the knife gripped tightly in my hand, I unzipped the tent and bolted out into the night. The footsteps followed me, quick, light, darting in and out of the shadows as I sprinted through the forest. I didn't dare look back. But I could hear them, always just behind me, laughing and singing as they chased me through the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My chest heaved as I fumbled for the keys, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. The forest was eerily quiet now, but I didn't feel safe. I started the car and drove, not stopping until I was miles away. Eventually, I pulled over at a small clearing by the road, my heart still pounding. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Or had I really encountered something paranormal? I didn't get much sleep that night. The sun rose early, and with it came the comforting sounds of birds chirping. I drove to a nearby gas station, grabbed some breakfast, and headed back to the campsite to collect my gear. When I arrived, everything was exactly as I had left it. There was no sign of anything unusual, no trace of the voices or footsteps from the night before. But I knew what I had experienced. It was real, and it was something I would never forget. I packed up quickly and left the forest, determined to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. When I got home, I called my mother to let her know I was back earlier than expected. I didn't tell her what had happened. I didn't tell anyone. But now I'm telling you. Do you believe my story? Kenneth and I had always shared a deep love for the outdoors. Growing up in the Swedish countryside, we spent our childhood exploring the dense forests and rugged mountains around our small village. Now, in our late 20s, we still thrived on the thrill of hiking and camping, venturing into the wilderness almost every weekend. We were seasoned hikers, comfortable with the challenges and unpredictability of nature. One late autumn evening, we decided to embark on a night hike through a forest near our village. It was known for its towering ancient trees and scenic beauty, but also carried a darker reputation. Locals whispered about strange occurrences and ghostly apparitions, but Kenneth and I dismissed them as nothing more than folklore, stories meant to scare children. With headlamps, sturdy boots, and a sense of adventure, we set off into the twilight. The forest canopy soon enveloped us in a world of shadows, the crisp air filled with the earthy scent of damp leaves and soil. The narrow trail twisted and turned through the woods, our laughter and conversation the only sounds piercing the silence. Remember when we got lost near the lake? Kenneth chuckled at the memory. How could I forget? I grinned. We wandered for hours. I thought we'd end up camping out there for the night. At least we had snacks, Kenneth joked. But seriously, we should be more careful tonight. Those stories about this forest are creepy, even if we don't believe them. Oh, come on, I teased. You don't actually buy into those ghost stories, do you? Kenneth shrugged. Not really, but it doesn't hurt to be cautious. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the daylight faded completely, and the shadows grew darker. Our headlamps illuminated the narrow trail ahead, casting eerie shapes among the trees. Occasionally, the rustling of leaves or the snap of a twig would make us pause, eyes scanning the darkness for movement. The forest at night was a different world, unfamiliar and filled with strange, unsettling sounds. We eventually came to a small clearing and decided to take a break. Sitting on a fallen log, we sipped water and enjoyed the peacefulness around us. The moon had risen, casting a pale light over the landscape, while the stars twinkled above. "It's beautiful out here," I remarked, gazing at the sky. Kenneth nodded. There's something magical about the forest at night. It's why we keep coming back. Just then, a distant, high-pitched scream shattered the tranquility. The sound was faint but unmistakable, sending chills down our spines. "What was that?" Kenneth asked, his voice tense. "Probably just an animal," I replied, though not entirely convinced. We resumed our hike, but something had changed. The forest seemed darker, the shadows more menacing. We walked in silence, every sound amplified in the stillness. The trail became harder to follow, the undergrowth thick and tangled. The farther we went, the more the forest seemed to close in on us. After another hour of hiking, we realized we were lost. The trees around us were older, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal arms. The path had disappeared, and unease settled in. "Great," Kenneth muttered, pulling out his map and compass. "We must have taken a wrong turn." I scanned the dark surroundings, hoping to find something familiar. "Let's backtrack a bit. We can't be far off." Just as we turned to retrace our steps, we saw something move ahead of us, a blur darting through the trees with unnatural speed. We froze, hearts pounding. "Did you see that?" Kenneth whispered. "Yeah," I replied, fear creeping in. "What the hell was that?" We stood still, eyes straining to see through the shadows. Suddenly, the figure reappeared, this time closer. It moved in quick, jerky motions, leaping from tree to tree. In the dim light, we could make out its humanoid shape, long tangled hair, and limbs that stretched unnaturally. "It's not an animal," Kenneth whispered, his voice trembling. "It's something else." The figure stopped on a branch above us, its hollow eyes glowing red in the darkness. Its face was gaunt, with a twisted, grotesque grin, revealing jagged teeth. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Kenneth's arm as we bolted down the trail. We sprinted through the forest, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The figure pursued us, leaping from tree to tree, its mocking laughter echoing through the woods. It wasn't just a creature, it was something far worse, something out of a nightmare. We stumbled into another clearing, legs burning with exhaustion. Collapsing to the ground, we gasped for air, hoping we had lost it. But the silence was soon shattered by a blood-curdling scream. The figure emerged from the shadows, hovering above the ground, its eyes glowing with malice. "We have to keep moving," Kenneth panted, struggling to his feet. "There's an old cabin nearby," I gasped. "If we make it there, we can barricade ourselves inside." With desperation fueling us, we raced toward the cabin, the creature close behind. The forest seemed to twist around us, the trees warping into grotesque shapes. Finally, we spotted the cabin, a dilapidated structure hidden among the trees. We burst through the door and slammed it shut. Inside, the air was musty, thick with decay. We barricaded the door with whatever we could find, an old table, some chairs, a wooden beam. Outside, we could hear the creature scratching at the walls, its whispers promising pain. "We can't stay here forever," I said, clutching a rusty axe I'd found. "What's the plan?" Kenneth loaded an old hunting rifle we'd found, his hands trembling. "We'll fight if it gets in." The minutes stretched, each one heavier than the last. The creature's assault on the cabin intensified, its fury shaking the walls. Finally, with a crash, the door flew open, and the creature surged inside, its eyes blazing with unholy light. Kenneth fired, the shot echoing in the small space. The bullet struck the creature, but it only laughed, lunging at us with inhuman speed. I swung the axe, connecting with its head, but it barely flinched. Kenneth fired again, this time hitting its eye. The creature shrieked, recoiling. Seizing the moment, I swung the axe with all my strength, embedding it in the creature's neck. It let out one final gurgling scream before disintegrating into black smoke. We collapsed, battered and bleeding, but alive. As dawn broke, we staggered out of the cabin, the forest now eerily quiet. We had faced a nightmare, and survived, but we knew the forest would never feel the same again. The legend of the witch was real, and we now carried the warning. The woods held beauty, but also darkness that should never be disturbed. Now, we were the ones telling the stories. Stories meant to scare others, but also serve as a reminder of the dangers that lurk in forgotten places. Hope you liked my first video. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you next time.